Children grow up so quickly, don't they? Take today's gospel reading, for example. It seems like only yesterday, or maybe it was the day before yesterday, that we were celebrating Jesus' birth. And now look at him. He's 12 years old. Happens just like that. But when you are looking for an appropriate Jesus story on the Sunday after Christmas, something after his birth and before his baptism, you have trouble coming up with just the right one. We don't have that many stories about Jesus during this period of his life, only a couple of them. And this story about the boy Jesus in the temple is the only story from his boyhood. Because of the way the lectionary works, this story comes up in public reading only once every 3 years. So there are regular churchgoers who don't hear it very often. And those preachers who take the Sunday just after Christmas off don't preach on it very often. So it's possible that there are some people in this room who have never heard a sermon on the boy Jesus in the temple. Well, that's about to change. There are other stories about Jesus' boyhood, of course. Faced with that 30-year silence between his birth and his baptism, some of the ancient writers felt compelled to fill in the gaps. They invented stories about the boy Jesus and his friends and some of the minor miracles he performed. In one of them, he scoops up clay from the riverbank, makes it into little birds, and then waves his hand over them and watches them fly away. In another one, the little boy Jesus wants to play in the clouds. He decides to climb up a sunbeam, and some of his little friends try to follow along without much success. And then there's a story about a dying child who is dipped in Jesus' bathwater and miraculously restored to health. It shouldn't surprise us that none of these stories has made its way into the canon of Holy Scripture. The only surprising thing is that there aren't more stories in the Bible about the boy Jesus. Only this one, about the time he went to the temple when he was 12 years old. Let me invite you to turn to chapter 2 of Luke's Gospel, beginning at verse 41, and follow along, because there are some things you might miss in this story if you are not looking carefully. First of all, notice that Luke says Jesus' parents went up to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover every year. And when he was 12 years old, they went up again as usual. It makes me think that perhaps Jesus had accompanied his parents on some earlier trip. Maybe this is what they always did, went up to Jerusalem for the festival, and it's only this particular time when this thing happened in the temple that has been recorded. The Passover was one of 3 annual festivals held in Jerusalem that every Jewish male was supposed to attend. Most of them couldn't get away for all 3, but they all seemed to make it to this one, the big one. I can imagine a few people staying behind in Nazareth just to keep an eye on things, but most of the rest of the village making this pilgrimage, heading down the road to Tiberias there on the Sea of Galilee, and then following the Jordan River south down to Jericho, and then starting up that long, winding road to Jerusalem, 18 miles away. I picture them cresting the Mount of Olives and looking out across the Kidron Valley at the beautiful city of Jerusalem gleaming like a pearl in the afternoon sunlight. Along the way, they had been singing those psalms of ascent, like Psalm 122 that says, "I was glad when they said unto me, let us go to the house of the Lord." One that includes this line, "Our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem." Can't you imagine that when that happened, when they actually stepped inside the gates of Jerusalem, it was tremendously exciting for a 12-year-old boy. And really, for everyone to celebrate this annual festival of Israel's freedom, to commemorate that time when they were delivered from their captivity in Egypt. The celebration went on for more than a week, and even at the end of it, there were those who weren't quite ready to go home. Apparently, Jesus was one of those. Assuming that he was in that large group of travelers from Nazareth, his parents set off toward home, and it wasn't until they made camp that night that they noticed Jesus had been left behind. We sometimes blame Joseph and Mary for being negligent. I mean, how could you forget Jesus? But think how it must have been for them. The guilt they must have felt, the panic that set in. I can't imagine that they slept well that night, and I would guess they were up before daybreak the next morning, getting ready to go back to Jerusalem. It would have taken them another whole day to get there. And then by the time it was light enough to look the next morning, it would have been 3 days since they had made any contact with Jesus. They must have been frantic, going from one place to another where they had been with him, searching high and low until they found him in the temple, sitting there with those religious authorities, listening to them and asking the occasional question. I know you've seen these pictures in your Sunday school literature. There is 12-year-old Jesus, the center of attention, while all the scholarly rabbis stand around stroking their beards, listening, nodding their heads in agreement. They were amazed at his teaching. But Luke says that his mother, Mary, had a different response.